Welcome to New World Now, where host Kim Corbin has compelling conversations with authors published by New World Library. They will discuss their personal journeys and share practical tools we can use to be more aware, mindful, and present in our daily lives. Now, here's your host, Kim Corbin.
Well, one might expect us to publish books about mindfulness, spirituality, and best practices for a life well lived. In the 12 years I have worked at New World Library, I have also had the pleasure of collaborating with numerous authors who write about consciousness from the perspective of the afterlife and what happens when we die. Each and every one of them has offered hope for what comes next. I've worked with a forensic pathologist whose book documents otherworldly occurrences as people transition between life and death, psychics, mediums, a skeptic who made contact with the sun on the other side through a process called automatic writing, and most recently, my guest today, linguist Lisa Smartt, whose book, Words at the Threshold, provides a fascinating exploration into the language of the dying. Steve Jobs' last words were, "Oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow." Thomas Edison said, "It's very beautiful over there." And they aren't alone. Over the last 5 years, in the first study of its kind, Lisa collected over 15 utterances from those who were a few hours to a few weeks from dying. And her book decodes the symbolism of those last words, showing how the language of the dying points the way to a transcendent world beyond our own. In addition to being a linguist and the author of Words at the Threshold, Lisa is an educator, a poet, and the founder of the Final Words Project, her ongoing study devoted to collecting language at the end of life. She also co-facilitates workshops about language and consciousness with near-death experience pioneer Raymond Moody at universities, hospices, and conferences. Lisa's passion and enthusiasm for her Final Words Project knows no bounds, and it's a real pleasure to have her as my guest for today's show. So welcome, Lisa Smartt, and thanks for being here.
It's great to be here with you, Kim. Thank you.
I thought that I'd like to begin by having you tell us about your dad's final words and how they ultimately inspired you to study end-of-life communication.
My father's final words over a 3-week period in which he was dying completely, obviously changed my life because I wrote this book, but in that moment, changed my ideas about language and consciousness. My father was a very skeptical person. He was, I call him a cigar chomping New Yorker in my book, and that's exactly what he was, very down to earth, didn't believe in anything beyond this world. So when he began to start speaking about angels a few weeks before he died, and speaking in fascinating, almost like riddles in his language and metaphors, I became very intrigued and wrote down everything that he said. And at the very end of his life, 3 days before he died, he announced, "Enough, enough. The angels say enough. Only 3 days left." And indeed, 3 days later, he passed on. And this was very compelling to me because this was from a man who all my life made fun of the idea of angels.
Wow. Well, and then you took the words that you'd collected from him and wanted to research them, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I did. And I went to school. I studied linguistics at UC Berkeley, and my father lived close to campus. So after he passed away, I went back to UC, to the linguistics department, and I began to look through all the journals and the databases to find out more about final words, thinking I would find an abundance of material. And actually, I found almost nothing. All I found was a tremendous amount of information about end-of-life directives and, more medically related, but no one had done a study at the language of people in their final days and their final words, a linguistic study. So I thought, oh my goodness, this is an area that needs to be studied.
Yes. And then how did you collect your research for the Final Words Project that you share in the book?
Mostly, I invited beloveds to take transcripts and write down words that they were willing to share with me in their loved ones' final days. I spoke to hospice workers throughout the U.S. and Canada. Plus, Raymond and I established a website, Raymond Moody and I established a website where people could submit accounts confidentially, and we received a lot of really marvelous accounts that way as well. And as people began to know that I was doing this research, they were interested, and many found that writing down their loved one's final words offered a chance to almost enter into a new dimension, a new realm, as they wrote down those last utterances.
And tell us about some of the common themes or metaphors that you uncovered in your research.
There are several types of themes that come up. First, the metaphors of a trip or travel. They're very prevalent. And people make reference to passports and different forms of transportation coming to take them somewhere. And most often you hear people make references to going home and being taken home or to some other country. There are also metaphors that are closely connected to people's lives. For example, dancer Jeffrey Holder, his very final words were arms, 2, 3, turn, 2, 3, swing, 2, 3, down, 2, 3. So people often use the language and the metaphors that are very connected to who they were as people.
Anything else? Any other themes?
Oh, definitely.
I know you got more.
The other is that people often speak of a momentous event coming. So another woman shared with me, my grandmother woke up in the middle of the night and started getting dressed in a long gown that was in the back of the closet. She was sitting at her dressing table, putting on jewelry and makeup. An aide came in to see what was going on. My grandma said, "Why, I'm getting ready for the big dance." She then lay down on the bed and died. People announced some kind of great event coming, anywhere from chess tournaments, bridge games, dances, large dinners. My father had talked about the big art exhibition that he was looking for. The other kinds of themes we see are there's a tremendous amount of repetition at end of life, just like the Steve Jobs quote that you had mentioned. And commonly we hear things, for example, "Do you hear that music? It's so beautiful. It's the most beautiful, beautiful thing I've ever heard." And there's a tremendous amount of use of repetition, which we don't see as commonly in our everyday life. We also see several types of what we might think of as nonsense. One type is called hybrid nonsense, where people will speak of things of this world and then also of an unseen world. For example, someone might say something like, "Get me my camera. I need to take a picture of this." But we don't know what the this is. They're looking beyond. So they're speaking of something in this world, referring to something unseen. Someone said, "They left the ladders, but the ladders are too short to go up there." Again, pointing upwards, but the ladders are outside.
Right. Fascinating. And I found the section of the book about takeaway figures who come from the other side to escort the dying across the threshold, especially comforting. And I'm curious how common that phenomenon is. And if you could share a quick example of a takeaway figure story that you discovered in your research.
Last night I spoke to hospice professionals, and they told me that the number one predictor of death is when someone starts speaking of a takeaway figure. We are hearing now from other researchers as well, it's 70 to 80%. And people will say, "Here comes Mom, here comes Earl." Very simply, they will refer to someone who passed on before them.
Right. And you offer wonderful advice for those who are sitting with the dying loved one in the book, which is something that we all will have to do at some point in our lives. And I'd love for you to share some of that with us here.
Rumi has a quote, "Without thinking of the letters, listen to the language of the heart." And I think that's a great key to sitting with someone bedside. Enter the world of the person who is dying. If they start speaking of nonsensical things or things you do not see, enter into that world anyway. Do not ever question the validity or the reality of the person who's dying. Have eyes for the sacred. Walk into that territory with your loved one, holding the possibility that that is sacred ground, because indeed it seems to be. Validate the person's words and experience. If they say, there's the green mushroom growing outside the window. Oh, wow, there's the green mushroom growing outside the window. Tell me more about that mushroom. Keeping a final words journal, I think, is a wonderful way to study the language and also enter into your loved one's reality. And always assume that people can hear you, even if they seem unresponsive, because all the research indicates that people are usually much more aware than we may think in those last days.
And in the book, you write about how terrified and unprepared you were when your dad asked you if he was dying. And by the time you had an answer that would allow you to speak literally and honestly with him about it, it was too late to have that conversation. He was farther along in his process. So I'm curious what you would say now if someone asked you if they're dying.
What a great question. I would probably ask them first, what is your experience now, and what do you think is happening, and how would you describe it? And then I would also say, yes, I have been told you're dying, but I'd want to hear first what their experience is, and because I would be curious, but I would answer the truth and without fear, because I've come to feel it's not that frightening.
Right. And I really appreciated in the book how you honor that for some people it is too frightening to talk about, and when it is that there's more happening than verbal things in those moments.
Yes, we can enter into those worlds or into those moments that feel frightening, however we can. Sometimes all we can do is just put our hand on someone's shoulder. But if we can somehow match the language of the person who we love, and as we would with children, children say things that all the time we could be afraid of or think are ridiculous, but we know that love is about matching or entering the world of the people close to us. Now, sometimes when someone's dying, they don't communicate at all, but all the indications I have from the interviews that I've had with so many people, that if we can sit in prayer beside someone and imagine we're speaking to them, or even just send love and be present with them, that sometimes you'll see a finger move or a head turn towards you. So, really have faith again. People who have near-death experiences talk about having telepathic communication on the other side, that is the primary, most essential language. And I have come to think that might really be true, that maybe perhaps telepathic communication is maybe the essential. It's what we come into the world as children when we don't speak, and how we might leave. So if your loved one is not speaking, just sit with them and be fully present.
And you say that listening to and honoring final words will make the dying process easier for our beloveds, and at the same time, transcribing the words can be healing for us as we move through the loss of someone we love. And you also talk in the book about how art is such a powerful healing tool. So I'd love to hear you talk about the role that writing your book has had in your own grief process surrounding the loss of your dad.
Another wonderful question. Thank you. Well, there are two parts to that. My mother is a ceramicist, so many of the final words that I transcribed of my father, we turned into plaques. We made these beautiful plaques that we then pit fired, and they're hanging on my wall. So it's beautiful to have some of those final words, such as I'll always hear you, was something my father said. That's on my wall. But writing the book completely transformed me. It was almost as if I felt I was in collaboration with my father and my ancestors as I wrote it. And I had no intention of writing it that way. I walked into writing the book more as a linguist and kind of with the hat on of a scientist of, okay, I'm going to, analyze all my data. But with every chapter, I get deeper and deeper into the sense that there was something very magical going on, and that through these final words, because the language we hear at the threshold is very different in many ways than the language we hear in our ordinary lives. It's more metaphorical. It's more like dream language and nonsensical, like Alice in Wonderland at times. But something about writing it down and honoring it, I found that for me, it was a transformational experience. And we know that mystics and poets, shamans, monks often use nonsensical language as a way to tap another world or another dimension. For example, koans, like what's the sound of one hand clapping. Oftentimes that very language that baffles us is the language that connects us to altered states of consciousness. And so writing this book really gave me a sense that the language we hear at the threshold is language that is cross-dimensional. It has its own power and capacity to move us and deeply transform our loved ones as they're crossing the threshold.
Mm. Most of the stories that you share in the book are positive, and that makes sense because I think that people would be more willing to share those. But you do say in the book that not everyone journeys gently into the good night. And I'm curious why you think that is, and if you have any words of advice for those whose loved ones had or are having a hard time letting go.
Yeah. What I've heard from a lot of hospice nurses, generally what I hear is that we die the way we live. And many times those who throughout their lives have worked with themes of surrenderance and acceptance oftentimes have an easier time at end of life. However, our bodies, we are physical beings. And just like with birth, I've been a mother, and when you give birth, you think, I want to have this beautiful experience that I'm just surrendering to the divine and bringing my daughter into the world or my son into the world. And sometimes it's not that easy. That's just the reality because of we are bodies as well as spirits. And I think it's also true at end of life. But what I've found is that the more we can invite those we love to imagine there is a journey going on, not a battle for their life. The words we use as we hold the experience are very important. It's a journey that we're undertaking. And if we ourselves can let go, I have heard over and over again from the dying that by the time they're ready to cross the threshold, most people feel they are moving to something else, even if they don't have the words for it. And what we can do, first of all, is to let go and invite them to enter into the light or to home, or using whatever metaphors our loved ones might use. But one person in the book shared a story of his father who used to always critically say to him, okay, stop complaining. Remember, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And he used to repeat that to keep his son on track. He was a tough army guy. And right as he was dying, as he was on his deathbed, he looked at his son and said, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And then his dad yelled, bullsh! And died. So, you wonder at that very moment he confronted the mystery and the reality that we all confront, that at the end we can only surrender. Yes.
Wow. And I love what you said about how when we do kind of consciousness work in this lifetime and we practice surrender, and I think that's really the connection for New World Library publishing these kinds of books. That's very, very much connected, the work we do here and the preparation that as we elevate our consciousness in this world, that we're more ready to just surrender to what comes next.
I think so. And I think, when I've spoken to many nurses who say that they have worked both labor and delivery and end of life, and there's a similarity to it. And as you said that, I got this image, when you're giving birth, contractions are very important. And as you're breathing and going with the contractions, the more you can relax into that, usually the easier the birth. And I almost get the sense that language at end of life are like those contractions, and that if we can go with the gibberish of our loved one and breathe with them and join them if there's gibberish or whatever interesting or unusual words, or like my father at the very end, and this is common, just reached up and twinkled his hands or like butterflies. And I remember when I was with him, I just kind of did the same thing, just as if we were both reaching for spirit. And it's almost, I've gotten a sense, just as there are midwives at end of life, there's this chance that we can be midwives or tourists and guides with our loved ones as they're making that final passage. And we're all new to this, to where we're exploring this together, I think.
Yes. And do you personally believe in an afterlife?
I do now. I believe in something. All I know that my fear of dying is gone. And I was very fearful at one time. And I think what I have seen in all the utterances and the interviews and research into dreams and the dying is that it really seems that we are programmed almost to work through our fears. And, we have dreams of taking journeys. We have dreams of people we love coming to take us. We have these visions and dreams, and we reconcile often with people. And it seems like my father, I remember walking into his room and I'd say, "How you doing, Dad?" "I'm working on myself. I'm working on myself," he'd say. And he was a man who, despite his fears and so forth, his whole life, he was working on himself. That was who he was as a person. And he was still working on himself in those very final weeks. And I remember Raymond Moody saying to me that dying can be a transformational experience if it's held that way instead of a medical disaster. As a matter of fact, I remember I was talking to Raymond one day, and we were talking about tattoos because he came in to California. And I said, "Well, so you're going to get a tattoo?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm going to put one on my chest that says, 'Do not resuscitate.'" Because he was talking about he wants the opportunity to fully go in through his dying process because he is so unafraid of it. So I am much less afraid. I'm not too sure if the afterlife is some person sitting on a throne somewhere with a long beard and holding a scepter, but I do think we return to something that is essential and where language is not spoken as it is here, but is the language that the people who have had near-death experiences describe, the language of heart to heart and mind to mind that is not spoken. Eben Alexander, who wrote the book Proof of Heaven, called it non-linguistic communication. And when we look at when babies are born, we connect with our babies and our children. There is something going on that's beyond words. And that's also, I think, the realm of love. I mean, really, it goes back to the Rumi thing, listen to the language of the heart, which is, not totally stuck in the letters, not stuck in the literal meaning of things.
Right. And I really liked the chapter in the book about after-death communication and the ways that people on the other side, the communication still continues. So I'm curious if you could share an example of the book of how that happens.
One of the most common ones that I found was through electricity. One woman described how her doorbell one night just started ringing, and she had a friend who actually was a contractor, and they kept playing with it, couldn't figure out, and she found out the next day at just about that time, a friend of hers across the world in Brazil had passed away unexpectedly of a rare form of cancer. Excuse me. Electricity commonly... synchronicities of rainbows appearing, hummingbirds, birds, text messages are appearing in the stories of people with after-death communication. And my own father started speaking poems to me that I wrote down and gave to my mother.
Right, I love that part of the book. And that was automatic writing, which could you briefly explain? Because I had another author who made contact with his son through automatic writing. So what is that and how does it work?
From what I hear from people is with me, I literally heard my father say, "Please write some poems for your mother because I'm concerned about her." They were married 57 years. He loved her. So it was in March. He died in February, so a few weeks later. And I opened up my journal because I do write in a journal, and it just as if my hands was just flowing. And I was partly conscious and partly not, just as the dying when those hybrid sentences seem to have one world in this, one foot in this world and one foot in the other. As I was writing, it was as if part of my brain was conscious of my writing and another part just flowed with it. And the poems, I think, are beautiful. I mean, and they touched my mother. And there are so many stories and people who may have been complete skeptics, but once they heard the voice of their loved one, and people over and over explain that there's a quality to the voice that they hear from the other side that's very distinctive from, that voice in your head that said, "Boy, you did a crappy job yesterday," or, thinking about your sister or something. It's a different kind of voice. And it oftentimes leaves people with a sense of comfort and assurance. So I would trust it. Anytime you hear it, go with it.
And even just sit down and welcome the dialogue and see what comes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm of the belief, my feeling as I've done this work in the last few years and wrote the book, where at times I felt that feeling of download that people talk about while I was writing, that I would write something and I go, oh, wow. And where does that come from? I am absolutely convinced that we are surrounded all the time by our ancestors and spirit. And I think spirit communicates with us in so many ways, from synchronicities to automatic writing to feelings in our bodies. I have woken up mornings now. I've learned to understand that feeling in my tummy that means something bad is happening and that I ate too many French fries the night before. And I think source and spirit is communicating to us all the time, and we connect through art, through dance, through many nonverbal modalities as well as verbal modalities. And the more that I've done this work, the more intrigued I've become with this idea of nonverbal consciousness and how important it is to connect with that, because messages come in so many ways. And if we're open, I believe Source is speaking to us all the time and inviting us to follow her or him to where we're meant to be and what our purpose is. And I feel with the Final Words Project so grateful that I entered into the realm of Final Words, because I really feel it's an invitation for me to do this work. And I did it. I left for Georgia. I sold everything I owned, and I went and studied with Raymond Moody. And I have no regrets that I listened to Spirit in that way and did this work.
Yes, I'm glad that you did. We have about a minute left. And at the beginning of the book, you say, one day, if not today, we will all sit at the bedside of someone we love and have a final conversation. And so in this last minute, I'd just love for you to share any final words of encouragement or advice for us when that time comes.
My first word of advice is just enter into it, no matter how scary it may seem, how strange the language may be. Walk into it with the sense that something sacred is happening. Spirit speaks in many ways, and one way Spirit speaks is through the language of the dying. And if you can sit bedside with the person you love and let them know that you know that the adventure that they're going on is sacred, then something very beautiful happens in that interaction in those final days.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for following your passion and answering your calling and writing this book.
Oh, thank you, Kim. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
For more information about Lisa Smartt and the Words at the Threshold, visit her online at www.finalwordsproject.org. And as always, if you enjoyed today's program and are inspired to leave a 5-star rating or review on iTunes, that would be greatly appreciated. I'd also like to invite you to join the New World Now podcast group on Facebook, where you can be a part of discussions, ask questions, and stay up to date on our latest podcast episodes. Just search for New World Now podcast on Facebook to join the group. I'll hope to see you there and look forward to connecting on future episodes of New World Now.
Thank you for listening to New World Now with Kim Corbin from New World Library. New World Library publishes books and audios that inspire and challenge us to improve the quality of our lives and our world. For more information about their books and authors, you can visit them online at newworldlibrary.com.